Hello, Armen. Hello, Professor.
Hey, Michael. Hey, Professor Suny, and hello, everyone.
Armen's about to introduce our guest, but for those of you watching, we have started a series of interviews with like real smart people, like book smarts. They know their stuff, and here we are. Hollywood in History is the name of the podcast. I call myself book stupid, but Armen's my, book smart one. And he said, hey, let's bring some real smart people on. And I said, absolutely. Cause, I need to get my facts straight. So thank you again, Professor, for joining us. I'm just a kind of a Hollywood guy, real quickly, unless Armen has already told you. He and I met because I stumbled across the Armenian Genocide and a character named Soghomon Tehlirian. And it turns out I got the rights to the story, and I think it's an important story. And so I've kind of done a turbo, self-education with Armen as my, he throws books at me and takes me on trips to Europe to archives and stuff like that. And so, I'm thinking history is one of the most important subjects, and most people don't know anything about it. So that's why we're doing this, to try and get truth out there, get information out there about, what's been going on in the world and how it reflects on what's going on in the world right now. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Armen to lead this discussion.
All right. And by the way, Professor, I've warned Michael many times not to use that word, truth.
Truth.
It's a very dangerous word. All right. So our guest today is none other than Ronald Grigor Suny. For those of you who don't know him, Ronald Suny is the William H. Sewell Jr. Distinguished University Professor of History at the University of Michigan and Emeritus Professor of Political Science and History at the University of Chicago. He was the first holder of the Alex Manukyan Chair in Modern Armenian History at the University of Michigan, where he founded and directed the Armenian Studies program. He is the author of the Baku Commune, Class and Nationality in the Russian Revolution, The Making of the Georgian Nation, Looking Toward Ararat, Armenia in Modern History, The Revenge of the Past, Nationalism, Revolution, and the Collapse of the Soviet Union, The Soviet Experiment, They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else, A History of the Armenian Genocide, and a number of other works. He is currently working on a book on the recent upsurge of exclusivist nationalisms and authoritarian populisms, Forging the Nation, The Making and Faking of Nationalisms. His most recent books are Red Flag Wounded, Stalinism and the Fate of Soviet Experiment, and Stalin, Passage to Revolution, which actually appeared this month out by Princeton University. Professor Suny, thank you very much for agreeing to come on to our show.
Happy to be here.
So before I start off with the questions, I thought I would ask you something which isn't necessarily related to what I have written down. And we were speaking about it just before we started recording, but I wanted to ask you if you remembered the nature of our interaction during the first time.
I remember it very well. It was at Georgetown some years ago, and I gave a talk, I think, maybe on Red Flag Wounded, in fact, or Red Flag Unfurled, the first volume of this 2-volume collection. And Michael David Fox had introduced me and brought me there. And then there was a lovely reception. I think that's where we met, over a glass of wine, or a plastic cup of wine anyway.
The cheese platter and cold cuts to go along with it. And do you remember my first statement to you whenever I introduced myself?
I'm Armenian.
Armenian, and also about your book, They Can Live in the Desert but Nowhere Else. And unfortunately, I said something which I regret as soon as it came out of my mouth, when I said it's sitting on my bookshelf, but I still have not opened it. So fortunately, in the last 2 years since we met, I have opened the book. I'm more than 2/3 of the way into it now, but at least it's still there, and at least I have read at this point.
So every 2 years you read a book?
What's that?
Every 2 years you read a book?
Yeah, I try to keep up on my history as much as possible.
Yeah.
All right. So this is a question, Professor, which I've already asked others who have come onto the show, and I feel like it's always fun to ask it for somebody who's been in the field. What first drew you to history and also to become a historian?
I think my father. I think my father was born in the Caucasus, in historic Armenia, actually. He said under a tree somewhere between Erzurum and Trabzon. But they were Caucasian Armenians, and he grew up in Tbilisi, and he was there during the revolution and remembers when the Bolsheviks came to Georgia. So that history was told over and over again at the dinner table. And my parents, both my father, Gurken Suny, and my mother, Araks Kezdekyan Suny, were real Armenophiles, you could say. Real Haide Nassers. They were interested in Armenia. My father was the son of a musician, Grigor Suny, and they had choruses. They organized. There was a lot of Armenian in the family, but the problem was they wanted us, myself and my sister Linda, to be real Americans.
And sorry, where were you growing up?
In the 1940s.
In
Philadelphia.
So
I was born in Philadelphia. I was growing up in Philadelphia. They didn't teach us Armenian. I had to learn Armenian later as a graduate student. So I've never been totally fluent and at ease with it. I've learned a lot of different languages. But in those days, ethnicity, your national identity, was not popular. It was to be a real American because they had suffered being discriminated as Armenians, as people from some exotic country, starving Armenians in the 1920s and 30s. So I got really interested in the revolution, in the Soviet Union, in all of those things. So I became a Soviet historian. My mother warned me, don't get mixed up with the Armenians, meaning if you get involved with Armenians, they'll never let you go. I got involved with Armenians and eventually requested by Princeton University Press, a very emphatic editor there, Eric Weitz, and his wife, who works for the press, Birgitte von Reinberg, they commissioned this book, They Can Live in the Desert, but Nowhere Else. And so I wrote this history of the Armenian Genocide.
Right. And before we get there, I still want to probe a little bit deeper into your background. So as you stated, you began as a historian of the Soviet Union. And I thought, what was your first visit to the Soviet Union like? What sort of impressions did it leave? How much did it conform with what you had seen and read about the USSR before your first visit?
Excellent questions, Armen. So you have to understand that my father's side of the family was very pro-Soviet. My mother's side was more into the Armenian church and things like that. So my mother's side was what we call Ramgavar, or liberal democratic. My grandfather had actually been a member of the Armenian cell of the Communist Party in America until he denounced Stalin in the 30s and then was thrown out of the party. His music was never played again in Armenia until after Stalin died. So it's a kind of checkered history. But when I grew up, my father was still very pro-Soviet and very socialist, and sort of imbibed those ideas in me as well, right? So I take all those things very seriously. I'm totally unapologetic for it. I'm very influenced by Marxism. Consider myself a democratic socialist or a socialist democrat, right? And that gave me, I put it this way, a kind of double perspective on the Soviet Union and on America. One, I was on the left, so I was critical of America. I wasn't a communist or, unapologetically pro-Soviet as, say, old Stalinists had been. And when I got to the Soviet Union, to answer your question more directly, I was in love with the Soviet Union. Here was a non-commercial society. There wasn't advertising. There wasn't capitalism. People were reading books. There was a kind of simplicity, even a crudeness of the place. This is 1964, I first got there. And then 65, 66, I was there for a year as a graduate student doing my dissertation research in Moscow, in Baku, and in Yerevan. And my other impression was, oh, these are wonderful people, but the system is crude and it's so conservative. We were just about to go through the 1960s in America. Everything was up for grabs. But the Soviet Union, for all of its rhetorical radicalness, was extremely conservative, right? U nas seksa нет. We don't have sex here, right? I mean, they had sex, believe me, I can tell. But they basically didn't talk about it. No one kissed in movies. Of course, there was no drug culture or anything like that. So it was a very, very conservative society. But I loved it. I mean, I found wonderful people, simple people, people, by the way, in 64, 65, 66, who still believed in the system, right? Then as I went through the 60s and 70s, you could see the disenchantment growing, right? As you move into the 70s. And it started at the top with intellectuals and more educated people. And eventually then, you know, there was this radical effort by Gorbachev to reform the thing, and it fell apart very quickly. But I was always very pro-Soviet and in a critical fashion, I think. I mean, my work is, I think, stood the test of time and is accepted. But I like very much the Gorbachev program, that what can we do to make some alternative between neoliberal capitalism that was developing in the West. Remember, that was the time of Reagan and Thatcher and so forth, and this old Soviet system which wasn't working. Is there some kind of middle social democratic socialist alternative to these two extremes? Didn't quite work out.
You mentioned visiting Moscow, Baku, and Yerevan. I'm curious, what was Armenia like when you visited there? Was it a sense of homecoming, or could you feel an immediate intimacy with the people, the land? And over the next, let's say, 25, 30 years until the collapse of the USSR, did you see an evolution in how people thought? And you mentioned it just a moment ago, there was this disenchantment during the time when Brezhnev was the general secretary of the USSR, but were you able to discern that during your visits to Armenia?
So remember, when I was there, so 64, 65, 66, it was just after Khrushchev fell. I was actually in the Soviet Union the day that Khrushchev was removed as general secretary. And it was a time of hope that things are going to get better. The economy will improve. We'll have a more responsive government, etc. And then in April 1965, just after just before I got to Moscow, there were these demonstrations in Yerevan calling for mer horer, for our lands in Turkey. The first time the public had come out for genocide recognition, right? So, and the party boss of Armenia at that time was dismissed, but the government gave in and they built Tsitarnakabert, they built a monument to the genocide. So it's really interesting. Instead of this repressive, tyrannical regime that was the way the Soviet Union was seen in the West, you actually had a civil society of some courage which could come out on the streets and say, we want recognition of the genocide. We want Armenian to be the official language of this republic, and so forth, right? It was quite extraordinary. So I had a very different view. This didn't fit the model of totalitarianism, right? And many of my generations, when they went to do their research in the Soviet Union, found a much more lively, if conservative, as I said, society. And the old visions of this tyranny had to be adjusted at the time, right? So that was really interesting. Then as you go through, you know, as I would go back every time I was married, I went with my wife in 1971 there, and we stayed for a while. I was now doing research there. In those years, eventually you could see that people were becoming more discontent. But Armenia, unlike Georgia, was a much more supportive republic of Soviet power. And they got a lot out of the Soviet Union. And of course, Armenia could not survive without Soviet protection because it was surrounded by other countries like Turkey, and so forth. So they kind of conceded, and they hoped for improvements from Russia. Well, then came 1988, the Karabakh movement, and they expected Gorbachev to give them Karabakh. He refused to dismantle the Azerbaijani Republic, which would have led to strife all over the Muslim areas of the Soviet Union. And he warned the Armenians that, you've got 100 and some thousand Armenians in Karabakh. You've got more than that in Baku. If you start trouble here, who knows what's going to happen? Well, we know what happened.
Was that a veiled threat, or it was just a genuine warning?
It was a genuine veiled threat. Yes. He said what it meant, and it meant that. And within a few years, in January of 1990, there were pogroms in Baku, and Armenians had to flee, and they sent Azerbaijanis out of Armenia, and you have the conflict that we're witnessing today.
Yeah, and I definitely want us to get back to that just in a few minutes. One question I also had was, do you know what sort of reception that your scholarship had in the Soviet Union among the historians? Because of course, over there, the history that was written was very theoretically rigid, very much based on the interpretation of history as laid out by Marx, Lenin, and the socialism of those years. So, yeah,
I have the privilege of having been attacked by all three Caucasian republics. So my first book was the Baku Commune. It was attacked in America by some for being too Marxist, right? Though Princeton University Press published it. I don't think that's the kind of Marxist press. And in Baku, I was called Bourgeoisie Falsificator Historia Azerbaijana. You can almost figure that out even if you don't know Russian. I was a bourgeois falsifier of the history of Azerbaijan, right? And there was a book that said that about me there. Later, I wrote a history of Georgia called The Making of the Georgian Nation. You mentioned it. And I was criticized by Georgians in the Soviet period and the post-Soviet period. They like the book better now. I mean, generations go on and people like it. And then I wrote a collection of articles called Armenia in the 20th Century, which was about Soviet Armenia largely, the genocide and Soviet Armenia. And that became part of another collection called Looking Toward Ararat, Armenia in Modern History. And the Armenians didn't like that either. It was not nationalistic. I'm anti-nationalist as a matter of fact. So and it was, they could accuse it of being, just anti-Armenian. I was called Davajan, traitor to the Armenians. And indeed, the most recent work, the genocide book, which has been well praised in the West, is totally ignored by Armenians. Yeah. I have not read any significant reviews. People have tried to have it published in Armenia. The Armenian Museum, Genocide Museum, turned me down when I made a request that we have a conference there. I'm better received in Turkey. And that book has been translated into Turkish. Ancak çölde yaşayabilirler. They can only live in the desert. Yeah.
Yeah, let's definitely talk about the book. Before I let you explain where you got the title from. Of course, as you mentioned, They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else is somewhat of a departure from your previous studies on the Soviet Union, on nationalism in the USSR and the Russian imperial period, and also on Armenian nationalism. But perhaps you can tell us why you chose that title and where you got it from.
So I'm basically a Soviet historian. As you know, I worked 33 years on this book on Stalin, but my research was centered in the Caucasus. So Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia, etc. And then in the late 90s, 97, a former student of ours at the University of Michigan, a political scientist, who was teaching in Istanbul at Koç University, invited me to come to Koç University to give a talk. I thought, oh, go to Turkey. This will be interesting. Very interesting, 1997. But I wrote to him and I said, I'm going to come, but I'm going to talk about the genocide, which was, of course, illegal in Turkey. And he wrote back and said, talk about whatever you want. I'm leaving soon. So I went. I actually asked my colleague, Müge Göçek, my Turkish friend here at Michigan, I said, what will happen to me if I go there? My mother's worried if I go to Turkey and I talk about the genocide. And Müge said, don't worry, Ron. If anything happens, we can get you out. So that was reassuring. So I went to Turkey and I gave this talk at Koç University. The audience was mostly students. They were very interested. They were very attentive. The professors and others were very nervous. I gave the talk and I even had an interview in a newspaper, Gazeta Pazar, Sunday newspaper. And when I got back, another graduate student of mine said, this is amazing. There's an audience there. They're interested. We ought to do something. And so Müge and I and Kevert Bardakjian, my colleague at Michigan, and others formed a group that eventually became WATS, the Workshop in Armenian Turkish Scholarship. And for over a decade, we met 11 different meetings all over the world. And 2015, we met in Istanbul, not in Yerevan, by the way. They wouldn't invite us to Yerevan, but all over the world, including Istanbul. And we gathered together Turkish, Kurdish, Armenian, German, American, French, Dutch, and other scholars who talked about the genocide. Scholars talking to scholars. At first, Armenians wouldn't even come to our meetings. They refused to come until the Turks recognized the genocide. And I was saying, Babam, what we should do here is first talk and then we'll see where they come. And what happened was eventually a community developed of scholars. Okay, mostly on the left, former radicals like Taner Akçam and Halil Berktay and so forth, who had been in prison or been tortured or whatever. But eventually a community of distinguished scholars developed. And out of that came the most incredible amount of scholarship, of graduate students working, Turks learning Armenian, Armenians learning Ottoman, developing, working in the archives. The Erdogan regime basically opened up things, right? And for a while, things are not as good now, okay? We know that Erdogan has become much more authoritarian, but in his, we'll say, democratic period, right, after the year 2001, there was an opening. We created this body of scholarship. We published a number of books, Müge and I and others. And that gave me the background. I also learned Turkish. I didn't learn Ottoman. I'm not an Ottomanist. I have to depend on other scholars. But I can explain why that's how that works. But I learned Turkish, and I wrote this book based on hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of archival documents in German, in French, in English, etc., that we have. Taner Akçam says the following, that some of us work in the kitchen. We cook the dishes. That's Taner and archival scholars. And then there are others, like Ron Suny, I think he meant, who are the waiters who carry out the dishes already prepared to the eating public. So I'm happy to be a waiter. My book is a synthetic work. It's trying to explain why the Young Turks in 1915 decided massively to deport, assimilate, and murder hundreds of thousands of their Armenian and Assyrian subjects.
That, as a matter of fact, was the question I was going to ask you. So, as you said, it is a synthesis, and what that was leading to over here was, aside from writing a general survey of the genocide, what were you trying to interpret the genocide in a light different than it had been previously been understood? As you mentioned a little bit earlier, or there were works by, for example, Raymond Kevorkian or Vahagen Dadrian on the Armenian genocide, but yours, and this was something which I noticed once I finally got around to reading your book, was it was structured, at least the way it begins, much more differently than other histories on the genocide, because it begins by looking at it through themes on nationalism, on empire, on the Armenians and their coalescing into a modern nation. Again, it's a word that we use in our common parlance very frequently without really understanding that this word meant much more and was much more different as it was commonly understood 100 years ago too.
Yes. So when I got into the field, there was not very good scholarship on the genocide. It's hard to remember. So 20, 25 years ago, there wasn't much. There was polemic, and there were some interesting original sources in Armenian, in Turkish, and other languages, which had not been used very much, okay? And many of those original sources were subject to doubt by the Turks, right? Who attacked these sources, like Ambassador Morgenthal's diary or the letters that Armenians had discovered from Turkish officials and so forth. So Armenian scholars at that time, like Richard Hovhannisyan and others, and Vahak and Dadrian, were basically concerned to raise this issue, put it on the scholarly agenda, and attack denial, the denial, official denial of the Turkish government that this had never happened. And they did hard work, difficult work, and yeoman service to try to raise this issue. Now the issue got raised. There were people who then turned to terrorism, to again more by by deed rather than word to affect this change. But by the time we got around to it, our idea was we're not going to worry about whether there was or wasn't a genocide. We're going to examine what happened, and then why it happened. So not just the what, but the why. And then, if the shoe fits, see if the word genocide works. Actually, when I started working in this, I didn't use the word genocide. I used the word massacres and deportations because I wasn't yet sure about what had happened. And Dadrian attacked me for that. Now, at the time, what was the available explanation? If you noticed, Armen, and I think you indicated this because you've read a good chunk of the book, it's mostly about the pre-genocide. It's not about the genocide. It's about why did they decide to do this? And what were Armenians like? So there are a number of things. One, there weren't good explanations of why the genocide took shape. Armenians said to me, literally, scholars would say, Ronald, don't try to explain the genocide. If you try to explain it, you'll justify it. You'll rationalize it. And I would say, but wait, that's what we do as social scientists. That's what we do as Armenians. As scholars, we try to explain why such a thing could happen. Why would a government turn against some of its most productive people? What was going on in their mind, right? So, and if you accept that you don't have to explain it, then you're actually explaining it because you're saying they're Turks. That's sufficient. They're people who murder Armenians, right? So you have a racialist, culturalist kind of explanation. So what were the available explanations? There were two. One was Dadrian's. It's Islam versus Christianity. It's a religious struggle. I largely try to dismiss that. It's true that there were Muslims on one side, Christians on the other. These marked different communities, but this was not over doctrine, over different religious views. It was about much more fundamental political, territorial, aspirational issues. And the second one was about nationalism. Now, by the way, I'm not saying that religion doesn't play a role or nationalism doesn't play a role. But as you indicated, Armen, nationalism or the word nation is used to mean everything, right? If you don't have an explanation, oh, it's nationalism. So I was trying to say, wait, we better look at this more carefully, right? And see what's actually at play. And what I ultimately came up with was an argument that the Young Turks were empire preservers or empire savers. They wanted to create a more Muslim, more Turkish, probably more Turkish than anything else, empire. And they became more Turkic nationalist as time went on. And they saw the Armenians as in their way, as an existential threat to this creation of this Turkic Muslim empire. And ultimately, during the war, they set out to destroy the Armenian community, which they did through three means, as I mentioned: massacre, deportation, and forced assimilation, that is, conversion to Islam.
Yeah, and I think that also leads to the title of your book, right?
Yeah, they can live in the desert but nowhere else was a phrase by the main architect of the genocide, the one-time Grand Vizier, Talat Pasha, who sent such a memo out, or at least he said that to Ambassador Morgenthau. And indeed, they did drive people into the deserts of Syria, Der Zor, Raqqa, places where later ISIS was powerful and where there's still conflict today. And then, of course, once they were in the desert, dying, starving, hungry, diseased, more massacres occurred in 1916 to get rid of as many as possible. So the very deserts that they sent them into became a kind of cemetery for those who survived.
Yeah, and reading the primary sources from this period can be very difficult at times, especially if they're survivors' testimonies or eyewitnesses. I was wondering, were there any particular challenges you experienced when you were writing this book, whether it's from an epistemological standpoint or how you framed your argument?
Well, I realized as I was writing it that there's more material than anyone could even look at in a lifetime. The Germans were allies of the Turks. They were out there in the East. And they produced piles of documents, many of which have been used by scholars like Hilmar Kaiser, by Taner Akçam, and by others. So we have Austrian documents, we have Vatican documents, we have Italian documents, French documents, we have American archives. There's enormous amounts. And since that time, since we've started this work, it has also been possible by certain Turkish and Ottoman knowing others to work in the Ottoman archives. Now they're very messy. They need to be, but Taner Akçam, my friend Ozen Arslan, who's worked in the military archives, and others have done amazing work. Arslan wrote a dissertation in France based on military archives. I mean, it's all there. It's amazing what's available. And even in Turkey, the material that Talat collected has been published in modern Turkish. You can read it. They're memoirs of Turkish officers at the front in the East who tell about how much they hate Armenians and what's going on. So denial is impossible at this point. It's there. And then you can decide, do these in fact make up a genocide? And our group, Turks, Kurds, Armenians, and others, said indubitably, without doubt, this was a genocidal effort by a state to target and destroy a specific ethno-religious cultural people.
Yeah, and as you indicate, we who are working in this field right now, I work on the social life of Ottoman Armenians in the late 19th and early 20th century, really owe a debt of gratitude to these historians who have acted as trailblazers in our field to finally get us to the point where we're no longer debating whether or not a genocide took place, but now we're trying to understand the dynamics, the mechanisms that were in place to allow something like this to happen, and at least in my case, to try to see what was taking place before the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, and seeing, well, what else was there to life in the Ottoman Empire that sometimes becomes obscured when we come across these admittedly numerous references to violence enacted by the state or encouraged by the state against the Armenian population. And I think perhaps this also acts as a good segue into my next question, which deals with Solomon Tehlirian. I did look at the index, and I did at least go to the page on your book where you do mention Solomon Tehlirian. And I was wondering if maybe you can contextualize him, because as you probably know, Tehlirian has this outsized personality or profile the global Armenian community, not just in Armenia or in the United States, but there's songs about him you can find on YouTube. There's, of course, this towering monument of him in Fresno, California, where he's buried. But trying to go a little bit beyond that, is there a way to understand him better and view him as a man in his times?
Let me preface, before I get right into Tolerian, to say something that actually feeds into what you're doing, what your research is doing. One of the things I tried to do in the book, and this will lead to Tolerian, was say Armenians were not simply passive victims. They were not simply acted upon. They were actually Ottoman subjects, members of parliament, with their church organizations, with their clubs, after 1908, with legal political parties, right? All of these things, they were actors in the Ottoman political and social scene. And so I was very interested in bringing them back from the grave, so to speak, and saying, look, someone like Grigor Suny, a member of parliament, a great Armenian writer, happened to be a friend of Talat's, playing cards with Talat the night before he was arrested and eventually sent off into exile and murdered, right? So that's a complicated scene. So Tolerian, this mammoth figure, right, is also an Armenian who takes action in his hands, right? And again, for Armenians who have been portrayed as victims, as spineless in a way, as always put upon and never acting, for them, someone who's a real agent like Tolerian becomes extremely important, right? And Tolerian was successful. So we know that at the trial of Tolerian, he pleaded that he was somehow driven mad by the genocide that his parents had suffered, and all of that was not true. That in fact he in fact was an agent of the Dashnak party, of this effort to assassinate the leaders of the genocide, the perpetrators of the genocide, who had gotten away and escaped to Europe. And eventually, they got most of them. They got Shekir, they got Talat, they got Jamal Pasha in Tiflis, and eventually Enver Pasha was killed probably by the Bolsheviks. Some people say by an Armenian Bolshevik in Central Asia, right? Well, we like myths in our history too. So Tolerian is this mammoth figure, right? And his story is amazing. The trial is amazing. And that trial is important not only because he was vindicated and set free, even though he had committed murder, right? He had assassinated someone. But it led to Raphael Lemkin, saying, is there another way besides vengeful killings that we can think about justice? And eventually he would develop this very concept of genocide that was a development out of the idea of crimes against humanity, and that phrase, crimes against humanity, first appeared in May 1915, as you know, in a document of the Allied powers condemning Turkey for what they were doing and about to do to the Armenians.
Thank you. The next section actually does deal with current events, but we will still go back to the historic roots. One question I would just like to ask, and this is something which I've come across a number of times during dissertation defenses at Georgetown. Do you have an idea of a perfect source in your mind? You know, whether you began working in the 1960s, of course, the Soviet archives were largely closed at the time, but even nowadays, can you think of a source which you can imagine yourself working in Moscow or in DC and just saying, Eureka, this is exactly what I've been looking for?
There's no perfect source. What there are ways to read sources. So Natalie Zeman Davis, a great historian, has written a book about archives. The name is escaping me. Maybe you remember, Armen. It's a wonderful book. In a minute. Yeah. And in that book, she shows how you have to read documents, right? Every document in an archive. You have the book name?
Fiction in the Archives.
Fiction in the Archives. What a wonderful title, right? Fiction in the Archives. Every document is written by someone. So it's in some degree subjective. It might be a plea for something, a petition for something. It might be an accusation. It might be an indicting thing. It might be a denunciation. It could be all kinds of different things. It could be a cold-hearted report by a bureaucrat. But it always is a document that's created by a human being in a particular temporal and spatial context. And you, as a historian, coming from your own spatial and temporal context, have to read that document through that lens, through your subjectivity, making the effort that all good historians have to do to be as objective and neutral as possible. But, as a great German philosopher once said, guess who? Karl Marx.
Karl Marx.
Who educated the educator? Who educated the educator? Who's writing this account, right? So we all come with that subjectivity, but given the conventions and the rules and the protocols of our profession, we have to be as neutral, as objective, and as balanced as possible, which is what I tried to do. So I'm an Armenian. Okay, I'm born in America, but I'm an Armenian, and I'm still going to write a history of the Armenian Genocide because it concerns people I'm concerned with. But I have to do it in a way that it can be published in Turkey, hopefully in Armenia eventually, and people will read it and say, this makes sense. Turks will say it makes sense. Kurds will say it makes sense. I have a friend who's a Kurd, a very close friend now, and he read that book in its Turkish translation. And he was upset terribly because the Kurds were the major perpetrators of the killings. They were encouraged by the Turks. They were let loose by the Turks. And this poor Kurdish guy said, did we really do that? And I had to say, yes, you really did do that. Not you, but maybe your grandparents did. And how come Van, which was in a majority or plural Armenian city, is now half Turkish and half Kurdish? Why is Arshil Gorky's village a Kurdish village on the shores of Van? You have to ask. Why are the churches now used by the Kurds as barns, right? So that's your history. And look what's happened. And the Kurds recognize this, by the way. Officially, the Kurds all over Kurdistan, which is eastern Turkey, all over, and western Armenia, what do they say? They say, those Turks made us do it. They had you for breakfast and they're having us for lunch, right? And that as far as the genocide may have succeeded in cleansing Western Armenia of Armenians, now the Turks have a Kurdish problem, right? And what are you going to do with 12, 15, 20 million Kurds?
Thank you. I would like to switch tacks just a little bit. Of course, we historians are not in the business of making prognostications, and even as we speak, we are witnessing these very horrific scenes playing out in Nagorno-Karabakh, where there's this high-intensity conflict taking place between Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, of course, with Armenia, and against Azerbaijan. And we are seeing some very disturbing footage of indiscriminate shelling of Armenian towns and villages, and we're not political analysts so far as I know, but how can we best understand the historical roots of this conflict, Professor? Well, a lot of people will sometimes say, let's go back 2,000 years and say, there was this province of Artsakh where we have examples of amazing Armenian architecture, including churches and monasteries. Others will say, let's look back 100 years and the decisions that were made by the Bolsheviks once Armenia and Azerbaijan, which were, of course, independent republics from 1918 to 1920, were incorporated into the Soviet fold.
Unfortunately, Armen, history does not help us in this. In fact, history may be a burden. History may in fact, lead us in the wrong way. So everybody can make historical claims. They'll find a cemetery that was Muslim, or they'll find a church that was Armenian. Because when these areas were imperial areas, right, ruled by the Persians, later by the Russians, etc., people moved around. And you would have a town like Shushi, which was an Azeri town or a Muslim town. and later was cleansed and made into an Armenian town, and then was cleansed and made into an Azeri town, and then cleansed and made into an. So people moved around. Empires are about mixing of peoples, and nation states are about unmixing of peoples. And what we're seeing is in the Soviet period, and now the post-Soviet period, the unmixing, the making of ethno-centered, ethnically homogeneous nation states, Azerbaijan on one side, Armenia on the other. And you have two principles that are fighting each other. One is, this was our land, we were there first. And there are different claims to that, right? Both sides claim to be descended from the Assyrians, the Caucasian Albanians, right? Well, Caucasian Albanians were a people there. They had a language. They eventually converted to Armenian Christianity, and they assimilated into Armenians. They became Armenians. Armenians came there. There may have been other Caucasian Albanians in the valleys, in the plains of Karabakh, who became Muslim, right? So those things happen. Many people who are today Armenian or are Turks or Kurds in Western Armenia, in Eastern Turkey, in the Caucasus, may have the genes of other people, because that's the nature of empire: mixing, intermarriage, rape, pillage, and so forth. So people mixed. And in the days of the nation state, we try to unmix them, right? Which is also a utopian project and can lead to genocide. Right? We want to be pure, so we got to get rid of those guys. We want the land, but we don't want the people on the land. So it's a very dangerous thing. So history can be difficult. But there are two other principles that are in conflict. One is the principle that the Azeris will propose, which is recognized by international law, which is territorial integrity. Karabakh, at the time of the end of the Soviet Union, was an autonomous region within Azerbaijan. So the international community recognizes that the Soviet Republic borders are the legal borders. Karabakh was in Azerbaijan. It belongs to Azerbaijan. But there's a contrary principle, and that's a good old Woodrow Wilsonian, Vladimir Lenin principle of national self-determination. And that is that the people who are on that land should determine and be allowed to rule themselves in some form, as an autonomous zone, as a nation state, etc. 90% of Karabakh was Armenian when the Bolsheviks gave it to Azerbaijan. By the time the conflict started in 1988, it had fallen to 75%. Hey, 75%? That's a pretty good claim of national self-determination. Now, of course, after the conflict began, the Armenians drove out the Azerbaijanis, or they ran away, right? And they now have 100%. And the Armenians, face the facts, have taken over a large chunk of Azerbaijan, which was never part of Karabakh. They have about 20%, 15 to 20%, I don't have exact figures, of Azerbaijan is in Armenian hands. Armenia did not
I think
start.
It's about 9% from what I've read.
I'll give you any percent you like. Okay. Maybe you're talking about the 9% outside of Karabakh, right? Yeah. Plus
13% total is, I think, what I
All right, that's a
remember.
good figure. So you can imagine that Armenians are perfectly content with the status quo antebellum, before this current war. They don't want to change it. They've got the land. They're going to settle people in those lands, etc. The Azerbaijanis want that status quo to change. So if you're looking for who attacked whom, it's not hard to find. The Azerbaijanis want to change this. Negotiations, compromise, armistice has not worked in their favor, and so they went to war. And the war is brutal, and it's supported by Turkey, and they're bringing Syrian mercenaries there who were extremely brutal people who fought against and murdered Kurds in northern Syria. So this is a disaster. And my big question is, where is Russia? Where is Armenia's major ally at this moment of existential danger to Karabakh and the Republic of Armenia?
Well, that actually was a question I want to look at, or maybe we could discuss. Going back in time just a little bit, I know referring to Russia maybe not necessarily appropriate by 1920, 1921. At the very least, it was Soviet Russia. What exactly was the Bolsheviks' approach to this issue of untangling the Gordian knot, right? I think they issued these very self-congratulatory declarations in 1921, 22, saying that we finally resolved the nationalities issue and there should be no more enmity between Armenians and Azerbaijanis or Georgians, let alone the other numerous ethnic groups that made up what was going to become the Soviet Union at the time. But how exactly did the Bolsheviks, and maybe if we can also talk about Joseph Stalin, who was the commissar for nationality affairs at this time?
There's no mystery to what happened, right? So the Bolsheviks were faced with the reality that there were a number of republics that had been formed before the Soviets came, the Red Army came, and these became Soviet republics, right? And during that period, some areas, like Karabakh, had been fought over between Muslims and Armenians. Eventually, the Bolsheviks decided, first they gave Karabakh to Armenia. Then the Azeris protested. Then they changed their mind. Stalin was involved in that decision. And the decision was made because Azerbaijan was richer than Armenia. They had oil. The roads went to Baku rather than over the mountains to Yerevan or whatever. There were a number of reasons why they did it. And they thought they could solve this problem by ethnographically making boundaries that conform to the various nationalities and giving autonomy to this majority Armenian region, Nagorno-Karabakh, right? But it turns out that the autonomy was fake. It wasn't real. Sovereignty lay with Moscow and with Baku. And so the Armenians of Karabakh did not really have real autonomous self-rule. And by Gorbachev's time, they wanted to join Armenia. And they protested. People were in the streets. There were massacres in Sumgait and killings back and forth. And eventually, this conflict developed. So it's a complex thing. And international law tells you one thing, that territorial integrity should prevail. But this principle of national self-determination, which is ingrained both in the old Soviet constitution and Leninist practice and Wilsonian preferences, etc., also plays a role. And that's what the conflict is about. Now, some years ago, around the late 1990s, a very distinguished political scientist who was my colleague at Chicago when I was in a political science department, and now is at Stanford, and I, David Layton, wrote an article in which we tried to argue that you should compromise, that we could make, you could have de jure sort of official control of Karabakh by Baku, maybe a flag over the city hall or whatever. But de facto, the local people should rule themselves, right? So we made a proposal like that. Ter Petrosyan, the first president of independent Armenia, made a very similar proposal. He was constitutionally thrown out. Karabakhsis took over the rule of Armenia for a long time until the recent democratic revolution 2 years ago. And so no solution has been found. And when no solution is found for a very long time and people are entrenched, ultimately somebody, and in this case Azerbaijan, is going to try to solve this problem through violence rather than through negotiation and discussion.
And would it be correct to say that, because we touched upon the fact that there was instances of violence that had broken out between Armenians and Azeris even before the Soviet Union had came in and forcibly imposed its own solution in 1904 up until I think 1906, in the midst of the first Russian Revolution, there was these outbreaks of violence and massacres between these two ethnic communities, and apparently the Imperial Russian government is able to impose some sort of order, and that only remains in place until the October Revolution comes about and the Russian Empire disintegrates. And would it be correct to say that there was never an ability to there never really was the opportunity to reconcile traumas that had existed before then during the 70 years of Soviet rule? Was it just a case of the Soviet authorities clamping down on any effort to discuss this in a truthful way, and rather imposing this artificial notion of brotherhood among nations and, Druzhba Narodnaya, as, was constantly championed? Narodov. Mm-hmm.
I've spent a lot of my career fighting this notion. So when these conflicts began, when the Soviet Union began to dissolve, the general understanding was, there are ancient tribal struggles. These people have always fought each other. Look at 1904, 1905. Look at 1918. And now look at what's happened since 1988, right? Leaving out that centuries go by that the Soviet Union for 70 years kept the peace, right? So, and there were struggles, there were conflicts. I had an Armenian aunt who lived in Baku. I stayed with her. The Armenians lived peacefully with Azerbaijanis for a very long time. They got along well. But of course, I did notice that every time my aunt Nuna talked about Azerbaijanis, she did it rather condescendingly. Those people, Turk, they're Turks. So there was this sense of Armenian superiority over Azerbaijanis, etc. But even so, a constitutional arrangement, different times can change things. So we mustn't think of these as indelible, essentialist conflicts that must exist for all time. Nationalists would like you to think that. But in fact, we can imagine arrangements where people don't do that. There's less conflict today, for instance, between Hungarians and Romanians, with hundreds of thousands of Hungarians living within Romania, than there have been in earlier times. We are a population as Americans who in fact conquered a continent and drove the native people into reservations. There were savage wars. Are we to predict that today that enmity must in fact indelibly continue? Or are there ways that concessions can be made, recently by the Supreme Court, to recognize the rights of those people? I'm talking about Native Americans, not Afro-Americans who have their own complaints and own grievances that should be recognized, right? But at least with some Native Americans, arrangements can be made to alleviate those old conflicts. So I remain, as a person of the left, always optimistic, believing that human beings, under certain conditions, with the right institutions, can solve these problems. When that fails, what do you get? You get violence, you get warfare. This is a failure. This is a failure. This present war is a failure of Armenians, who had controlled that area, of Azerbaijanis, who couldn't find solutions, of the Russians and the international community that's allowed this thing to fester now for 30 years.
All right, Michael, I have no other questions, so if you want to...
I have several, but I don't know how much more time you have, Professor.
Very little, though, because I have a party I'm supposed to go to. So we can talk a little bit, okay? Let's finish.
I got about 3 quick questions.
Go for it.
1 or 2 of them are quick. First, I want to comment. You've brought up several historians that you've known and worked with, and even I, as a layman historian, being able to recognize these like people that you spout off. It's like, wow, okay, I'm in the right place. I'm listening to the right voices. I've been in the home of with Armen, and I have a story about going to Richard Hovhanessian's home, and I've met Taner Akjam. And then we spent several days and several hours in Berlin with Hilmer Kaiser. So
that must have been interesting.
It was very interesting. So
the highlight of our trip.
It was pretty interesting. And we also went to Istanbul on that same trip. And so we went into the Turkish archive in Istanbul. And for me, it's like, this is this incredible adventure that I've been on that Armen is kind of guiding. He's like my tour guide into this whole thing. You mentioned Grigor Zorab playing cards with Talat. And I've written, a first draft of a screenplay that includes a lot of these events, and Grigor Zorab and Talat obviously are characters. And so I'm curious about the documentation of that specific event. Was it the night before? How do we know that particular? Because I would include that in the script, because that's very dramatic to be betrayed by such a close confidant.
Yeah. Now that I think comes from Grigor Zorob's own account or a letter or something. I don't remember the documentation and all, but I think you can find that. That wouldn't be that difficult. To find that particular thing.
I've heard reference of it. I didn't know that it was alleged that it was the day before or something like that. I'll look more into that.
Yeah. In the book, it's in the book, but I don't remember what the source was. I'd have to get the book.
I should consult it now.
Yeah,
I'll have Armen look it up.
You can find it. Yeah.
Okay. So for decades, we've had president after president after president after president declare before their election that they were going to recognize the Armenian Genocide officially as this position of the United States. And then last year in April, the Congress of the United States passed House Resolution 296 at the time, and it was like 405 votes for and 11 votes against. So this in such a partisan country where, political realm where we live, to have such unanimity over this issue. And then it went to the Senate, and the Senate was unanimous in passing it. Yet it arrives at the president's desk and it goes nowhere. Can you give any insight into that? I mean, why is it like Ronald Reagan, I think, then the Clintons, and then the Obamas and the Bushes, and now President Trump, it just stalls out? Or, I mean, we've made it further in history last year, but still it's not been recognized.
Turkey is a very, very strategic ally of the United States. It's in a very delicate position. It was south of the Soviet Union. We had bases there. We still have bases there. It's above Syria. It's near Iran. So Turkey is more valuable strategically to the United States than is Armenia, little Armenia. And so though some will in presidential campaigns try to get Armenian votes by saying, we'll recognize the genocide, when push comes to shove, they don't do it. And the big case is Samantha Power, who had written a book about the shame of this non-recognition when she became a member of the Obama administration and our ambassador to the UN. She forgot about that. Now she's apologized for that. But this is politics. This is strategic. Israel has done the same thing. Israel's now aiding Azerbaijan, by the way, with weapons and drones and so on. And imagine the country that was founded by survivors of the Holocaust has refused to recognize the Armenian Genocide because people in power think strategically. They have to think of what they consider and make up to be their national interest. So it's not mysterious.
Yeah, I mean, I get that. I didn't think it was really mysterious, but it's frustrating and it's not perplexing. So,
but here's an interesting thing just to add to that, Michael. So last year, as you remember, under Nancy Pelosi's directorship and pushing, and she's very interested in this issue. I've met her and talked to her about it. She got through this resolution. But remember when it was? It was just after Trump had pulled our American troops largely out of Syria, sacrificed our Kurdish allies in some private conversations over telephone and letter with Erdogan. And this was an affront, what the Congress did to Erdogan and to Trump, right? And of course it didn't go any further. And Israel also talked about, played with the idea of recognition of the genocide when Erdogan was very antagonistic to Israel. And that, of course, dissipated as well. So it's a pawn in an international conflict.
All right, I have one last thought, and I'd be interested in your response to it. So in thinking about this current conflict, I mean, this resurgence of an ongoing conflict just in the past 2 weeks, and apparently it's escalated rapidly. One thought I had is, what if, because I had talked to Armen about this, that Nagorno-Karabakh, or what's the Armenian term or the name for it?
Artsakh.
Artsakh. So it's never been recognized by any nation, any state. There have been other, he says there's other unrecognized territories that have recognized it. What if a Russia or a United States of America were to, like by executive order, recognize Artsakh as a state? What would that do? What do you think?
I'd be for that, but
isn't that like the ideal? Wouldn't that be like the ideal scenario?
Oh, so there are a number of these frozen conflicts, as they're called, right? Now, Russia did recognize South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states. It didn't annex them, which is what they wanted, but it recognized them. And a few other countries here and there did as well. Some islands in the Pacific, Nicaragua or whatever, but almost no one seriously. Notice that Karabakh has not even been recognized by Armenia. And there's a kind of fiction that Karabakh is independent, etc. It's not completely independent. The sovereign power is probably Yerevan, but it has a degree of autonomy, etc. So it would change the equation. The major power in this region, the one that will dictate a solution, is Putin's Russia. It has to act. And right now, Putin is sitting back. He's watching what's happening. Maybe he's punishing the Armenian premier because he's the premier is attacking oligarchs who were close to Putin. Who knows what is going through the Kremlin's mind at the moment? But ultimately, Russia will decide this thing, and the Turks know that. And Turkey would be very wary about starting another conflict with Russia. It has one in Syria. It has one in Libya. Though who knows? When people are in power a long time, like Erdogan, they get megalomaniac, and they may act very irrationally. And we should watch out for them.
Well, what if Trump or Biden, like in the next 6 months or whatever, what if they, like Russia doesn't do anything, they go ahead and do it and insert themselves? I don't think
it would be impossible for them to do it. They would never do that.
Why do you think they would never do it?
They would never do it because they have relations with Azerbaijan and Armenia and Turkey and Russia, and it would confuse things too much, and it just is outside the possibility. Though we have such an erratic and irrational president.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. He moves the embassy to Jerusalem. He does these like random things that he gets a whim or says, "Why not? I'll do it." So okay, that.
But it would.
That was my thought.
We're not sending troops to that part of the world.
No, not troops, but just the fact of the recognition would change the dynamic, like the geopolitics, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, on another planet, maybe, but not on
Well, thank you for entertaining my fantasy.
My pleasure, my pleasure. It was really interesting, guys. Thank you. Send me a link when you put it up or whatever.
Michael, maybe you should also ask him something about a film, right?
Oh, yeah. So with
Real
all
quick.
of our guests, very quickly, since this podcast is called Hollywood and History, we've talked a lot of history. Professor, do you have a movie recommendation? Do you have a favorite film? And it doesn't have to be about history, just anything that you like, that you would recommend to someone who's a moviegoer or a movie fan.
Clay Pigeons.
I heard of that. Is that a Turkish film? No,
Clay Pigeons is a brilliant film. Joaquin, what's his name?
Phoenix?
Joaquin
Phoenix
is brilliant in it, and nobody knows the film. I have 2 copies up here. Go on and find it and watch it, and then tell me what you think. And also, you have talked to Eric Bogosian, I hope, about Tolerian, right?
We actually, my business partner has reached out to him, so we have.
He knows about this, and he wanted to do a film on this. I don't know whatever happened to that.
That's why we're reaching out to him because, I mean, there's a lot of moving parts, especially people have the rights to different things, and so
yeah. Eric is great. He wrote a good book about it. So
yeah, well, that's one of the first things Armen recommended to me, and I have it right here on my shelf. This one right here, yeah.
There you go. Nemesis, yeah.
All right.
So go look at Clay Pigeons.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for carving out some time for us.
Yeah, we'll talk again sometime. Bye bye.
Sounds good.
Absolutely.
Bye.